Okay, good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to another Zoom lecture presented by the Minnesota Archaeological Society. I will apologize, I don't have video capability tonight, so we'll just be, IAD is producing. We're trying to bring a lot more archaeological information out and available to the public. So we have the in-person lectures live and online, and then we do offer recordings of these available on our YouTube channel as well. So if you happen to miss one, you could check out our YouTube channel, and we're working on getting all of our previous lectures uploaded on there as well. All right, at this time, I would like to introduce our speaker for the evening. Tonight, we are very fortunate to hear from Rob Mann of St. Cloud State University, who will be presenting French or British, identifying the 18th century ceramics from Minnesota Fur Trade Post. Rob Mann is currently Professor of Anthropology, Director of the CRM Archaeology Graduate Program, Director of the Anthropology Laboratory, and Director of the Douglas A. Birk Collection at St. Cloud State University. All right, at this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Rob Mann. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, great. Thank you for having me, and thanks to the Minnesota Historical Society for inviting me tonight to do this presentation. I think this is a wonderful series, and I'm happy to be a part of this. So the talk tonight is titled French or British, Identifying the 18th Century Ceramics from a Minnesota Fur Trade Post. And so that's what we're going to dive into. I'm hoping to keep this presentation to about 45 minutes or so that we can have a little bit of time for some Q&A afterwards. So let's go ahead and jump right in and get started. All right, so this is going to be a talk in 3 parts. I have given this lecture one other time. I gave it for the CMA, the Council for Minnesota Archaeology meetings earlier this year. So if you caught that lecture, it might look a little bit like that presentation, but I have added and beefed it up a little bit with some additional information, so it won't be exactly the same. But it is still a talk that basically is broken into 3 parts. We're going to begin by looking at the archaeology of 21 MO20. It is the supposed site of French colonial Fort Duquesne. It's in Morrison County, not far from Little Falls, if you're familiar with that part of Minnesota. Then we're going to look at tin-enameled ceramics, or tin-glazed ceramics, as they're sometimes referred to, because those are some of the types of historic or European-style ceramics that were recovered from the site and played an important role in the designation of MO20 as a French era site, the French colonial Fort Duquesne. But we're going to look at tin-enameled ceramics from a broader perspective. Who else was making tin-enameled ceramics during this time, and what did those ceramics look like? Which will then lead us to the question for this evening, which is to answer whether or not the ceramic evidence from MO20 suggests that it was occupied during the French era or the British era. That is, are these ceramics French or British? And so we'll look then more closely at the 18th century ceramics from MO20 and compare them to other ceramics from other sites during this time period in this region in the mid-continent of the United States. And then we'll come to some conclusion, hopefully, about what we think, whether or not these ceramics are in fact French, as they have been previously interpreted, or British. And so that's kind of the outline for the presentation this evening. All right, there we go. So we're going to start by looking at the archaeology of 21 MO20, the supposed site of French colonial Fort Duquesne. And in order to talk about the history of the site, we have to start in the mid-1960s when a group of youths, some teenagers, found some rock piles in a field, a farm field or pasture along the Mississippi River. And they dug into them thinking that they might be Indian mounds and that they would be full of Indian artifacts. But they only found some nails and quote unquote dishes buried in thick layers of ash. And so they were actually very disappointed, right? They thought that these were just big trash piles. And so they they sort of discounted that and they moved on to other things, except one of the kids kept a shoebox or other kind of box full of some of the artifacts and sort of tucked them away as kids will do under the bed or in his room. And that becomes important a few years later. The first time archaeologists got wind that there might be something going on at this site was in 1972 when the MHS sent some archaeologists, including Doug Birk, and we'll talk more about Doug Birk throughout this presentation. These MHS archaeologists visited this locale in search of another site. They were actually looking for an 1838 mission site, Methodist mission site called the Little Elk Methodist Mission. And if you look on this map here, you can see, hopefully you can see my pointer, my cursor. Here's the site that we're talking about, MO20, the supposed French fort site. But down here is labeled the Methodist Episcopal Indian Mission. This is the site that they were looking for in 1972 because they had some documentation, historical documentation, that led them to the mouth of the Little Elk River where it flows into the Mississippi. So they were looking for that site. They did not find it at that time. But the locals told them about those rock piles, those supposed Indian mounds. And though the archaeologists were skeptical, they went ahead and they mapped those mounds, right? Quote unquote mounds. Now, we skip ahead about 6 years. And in 1978, Doug Birk happened to meet one of those teenagers who dug into those rock piles, and he had kept that material all those years later, right? So from the 60s until 1978, he still had those artifacts, and he pulled them out and he showed them to Doug. And Doug realized right away that those dishes were actually 18th century European ceramics. So all of a sudden, those rock piles that were mapped as supposed mounds become much more interesting to Doug. He realizes that there's something else going on there and that this site probably dates to the 18th century. The other thing that is happening around this time is that Birk and some other archaeologists form what is known as the Institute for Minnesota Archaeology, or the IMA. And it's the IMA in 1982, with Doug sort of leading this investigation, that goes out to MO20 and begins field investigations there. So those initial investigations are enough for Doug to realize that this is, in fact, an 18th century site, and that it is probably related to the fur trade. And so over the next decade or so, Birk is going to spend most of his research time investigating this site. So they return in 1983. They clear the site of vegetation. They mow it down. They get rid of all of the overgrowth that's there. And they map the site again, this time with the understanding that those stone piles are in fact collapsed chimneys from structures that were built there in the 18th century. So they map all of the surface features, including depressions and those chimney falls, and that this is done in advance of nominating the site to the National Register of Historic Places. The other thing that is happening during this time period in the early 80s is that the IMA, this non-for-profit archaeology group, is also very interested in purchasing properties that contain archaeological resources. So ultimately, this site will become part of what is known as the Little Elk Heritage Preserve, a 93-acre archaeological and nature preserve that was acquired by the IMA, the Institute for Minnesota Archaeology, which is unfortunately today defunct. It goes defunct in the early 2000s. At that point, the land was purchased by and taken over by Minnesota State Parks. And so today, this site, MO20, and some of these other sites that you see on this map are part of Lindbergh State Park. And I should mention that you can, in fact, still go to what was the Little Elk Heritage Preserve. There are still hiking trails there. There's a parking area. And in fact, there are some interpretive signage along those trails that tell sort of both the natural and cultural history of the of this location, including the site of MO20, which is fenced off, but the National Register plaque is there, and there's some signage related to that as well. So it is still a publicly visible site. You can still visit it and see it today, though I have to say the last time that I was there earlier this summer, it is very much overgrown again. So it hasn't been maintained the way that it would have been when Birk and the IMA were there and working with the site. Okay, so moving on then. So Birk and his IMA crew go back to the site again in 1984, and this begins the first of a series of very intensive field investigations at the site. Very meticulous investigations, a lot of piece plotting, as we'll talk about here in just a moment. And Doug realized that this site was unique in that it did not appear to have been plowed, so the disturbance was very minimal. And Doug was also adamant that the excavations be done by trained professional archaeologists rather than student archaeologists in training, right? So field schools. So this was all done with professional trained archaeologists to take very meticulous care of this very pristine site. That year, 1984, when they conducted these investigations, was the same year that the site was in fact listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And as I said, you can still see the plaque there at the property if you go and visit it today. 2 years later, they returned again in 1986 for a second round of more extensive excavations. And those excavations again resumed in 1998. Now, they did some additional work there throughout the 80s and perhaps even into the 90s, but this was the bulk of most of the field work that was done there. And much of it centered around the excavation of the central structure, which you see here in this photograph and in the map on this slide as well, right? So the central structure at MO20 measured about 5 meters by 7.5 meters and consisted of 2 rooms, one of which was heated by one of those stone hearths, one of those collapsed chimneys that those teenagers dug into in the 60s and were originally mapped by Doug and the MHS archaeologist in 1972. The smaller room was probably used for storage. And I showed this other hand-drawn map. This is from Birk's excavations at the site to show the meticulous nature of the excavations that went on there and the piece plotting of just about every artifact. So they excavated mostly by trowel, not with shovel, and they went down in 5-centimeter levels and they piece plotted artifacts as they went along. They were so meticulous that you can even see the patterns of the floorboards inside the central structure, because you can see where these lines of artifacts, those are artifacts that fell between the cracks of the floorboards. So you can kind of see these parallel lines indicating where the floorboards were in this structure. They were also able to discern what they think the structure might have looked like. It is built in a French vernacular style, which is very important in terms of the interpretation of the site. Actually, 2 French vernacular styles. Doug believes that on the gable end, the structure was what is known as poteau en terre. That's just a vertical post set in the ground, directly in the ground, so post in ground. And so you can see this trench here. That's where Doug sees a line of posts that indicated to him that this was a poteau en terre wall. But the long walls of the structure seem to have been built in a different style known as pièce sur pièce, or piece on piece, or sort of log on log. Both styles would have been very common among French-speaking peoples in this part of the world in the 18th century, and they are very much associated with the fur trade and with fur trade structures. So again, it kind of goes along with Doug's ideas that this site dated to the French colonial period, and helped him to formulate his understanding and interpretation of the site. Okay, I should probably just kind of pause for a minute and say something about Doug very quickly. For those of you who don't know, and I'm assuming that many in the crowd tonight know of Doug or maybe knew him personally, Doug was a longtime Minnesota archaeologist. He worked in the state for at least or very nearly 50 years, so many decades of work. He did a lot of work, a lot of different kinds of work, but he's known for a few things, and one of those things is for his expertise in the fur trade. So Doug was, in many ways, a fur trade archaeologist. It was one of the foci of his research for many, many decades. I got to know Doug in the 1990s when I was doing my own work at a fur trade post in Indiana. It's a very long story, but I'll just keep it brief and say that Doug came to Indiana with the screen setup that he used at MO20 to help me with my excavations at a 19th century fur post on the Wabash River in Indiana. So I got to know Doug then, and we stayed in contact over the years. And so when I arrived in Minnesota in 2013, the first archaeologist that I contacted, of course, was Doug. And I said, hey, Doug, I'm in Minnesota. And so we reconnected and we had begun to work together. In fact, in 2014, I led a field school at that mission site, which Doug had eventually gone back and located archaeologically at the Little Elk Heritage Preserve. And so we were working together on several potential projects when Doug unfortunately passed away in 2017. And with the assistance and help of his partner, Linda Weiss, and with the assistance and cooperation of the Morrison County Historical Society, St. Cloud State was able to get access to and acquire what we now call the Douglas A. Birk collection. And it really consists of three parts. It consists of Doug's very extensive personal research library, and you can see a photograph of it here, with a lot of wonderful sources that would be very difficult to find otherwise. And this is just a portion of the library. This is not the entire library. It also consists of Doug's professional papers spanning over 50 years, including his extensive field notes and research notations about numerous kinds of artifacts and sites. He was a fantastic cartographer. He drew lots of maps. He also was a fantastic artist. He sketched and drew and did his own artifact illustrations. A lot of that original work is in these boxes that are part of his professional papers. We have 45 linear feet of materials in the Birk collection archives. These are open and available to researchers. So I have 2 graduate students right now who are working on master's theses with Birk collection materials. And we have had 1 master's thesis completed already from materials in the Birk collection. Importantly for tonight's talk, the other thing that we have on permanent loan from the Morrison County Historical Society is the 21 MO20 Archaeological Collection, which you see down here, 1 drawer of the materials from that collection in our new curation facility and new curation cabinets. So Doug had kept control of the collection even after the IMA went defunct, with the idea that he would eventually write up the final report of all of those seasons of work at MO20. And unfortunately, that didn't come to pass. And so there is no final report on the site. So hopefully that is something that we will continue to work on now that we have the collection at St. Cloud State. But we have rehoused all of the artifacts from the site. Many of them were still in the paper bags that they were probably put into in the field in the 1980s. So we've rehoused all of that information using the catalog that Doug had created. So there was a catalog, fortunately for us, and we have used that catalog now to rehouse all of the material into more modern curation facilities. And that is all now available for researchers as well at St. Cloud State as part of the Birk collection. Of course, the ceramics that we're talking about tonight are also part of that collection. So it is an important collection that still has lots of research potential, as we'll see here tonight. Okay, so all of this archaeological evidence, all of that material collected from MO20 suggested to Doug that the site was occupied sometime during the mid-18th century, and he combined the archaeological data with a very careful combing of early historical records for this part of the world, Minnesota and the upper Mississippi River Valley, and he proposed that MO20 represented the material remains of Fort Duquesne, a temporary outpost built in central Minnesota by Joseph Marin, who is described as an explorer and officer in the French regular troops, but also a fur trader. And it should be noted that Birk always presented this interpretation of MO20 as a working hypothesis. So Birk did publish a couple of chapters and articles here and there on MO20, but never the sort of the final written report never did come out. But when he did talk about the site in these publications, he always framed this interpretation as a working hypothesis, and he noted that that could change or be tested with every new turn of a shovel or archival page. So he was always open to reinterpreting the site if new information came available. And so that's an important part of this story as well. Okay, so let's look then at that ceramic evidence. These are the ceramics that Birk collected, mostly Birk collected. There's one piece that we'll talk about in just a moment that comes from outside of the professional work done at the site. But these are the ceramics, the European ceramics collected from the site. So the first group of ceramics that I want to talk about is what archaeologists call Westerwald German salt glaze stoneware. And Doug's absolutely correct, right? So he identified these as being Westerwald German salt glaze stoneware, which has these which is decorated with incised and stamped flower motifs, checks, and abstract designs that are usually filled with a very rich cobalt blue decoration. And so these pieces are absolutely that, right? They meet that definition exactly. Now, we date these to sometime after 1600 up until about 1775. So they would fit very nicely within that time period that we're talking about, the mid 1700s, the middle of the 18th century. So Doug was very comfortable with these being part of this mid 1700s archaeological site. Then there are the tin-enameled or tin-glazed earthenware that was recovered at the site. And we can define it as a soft-bodied earthenware ceramic with a lead glaze to which has been added tin oxide and then is often painted with blue and polychrome designs. Now, they have an early start date as well, about 1628, but they have a pretty good terminal date of about 1800. So when you find tin-enameled artifacts, tin-enameled ceramics on an archaeological site in this part of the world, you can almost be certain that that site, or at least that part of the site, dates to the 18th century, because after 1800, you really don't see much tin-enameled earthenware making its way to this part of North America, even though it's still being made in Europe. Okay, so these are the tin-enameled, at least most of the tin-enameled earthenwares recovered from the site. Now, the question becomes, are those tin-enameled earthenwares faience, right? And so that's where it gets a little more interesting. So this is Birk's hand-drawn illustration of 3 pieces of tin-enameled earthenware that he recovered from the site, along with this important corner, this piece up here in the corner that was part of the artifact collection that the teenagers excavated or dug out of those chimney piles in the 1960s. And incredibly, it mended with one of the sherds that Birk collected, right, excavated. So with it, we get a pretty good idea of what the decorative motif is. And this decorative motif is really important. Now, when Doug first saw this sherd in that shoebox in 1976, he immediately identified it as faience. And with that identification, that sort of stuck with him throughout his excavations of the site. So when he found additional tin-enameled earthenwares, including things that look like these two sherds here, he also identified them as faience. He had also, by this time, right, he's assuming that the site is French. And if you assume that the site is 18th century and French and you're finding tin-enameled earthenware, then your other assumption is that it is faience. And why is that? Because faience is the style of tin-enameled earthenware that was being made in France during the 18th century. So these tin-enameled earthenwares are very chronometrically and geographically diagnostic or sensitive. And they were being made by different European countries all during this time period. However, if they're made in France, they have a particular style that they're made in, and we call those tin-enameled earthenwares faience. If they're made in Spain, they have a particular style that they're made in, and we call those majolica or majolica, depending on how you pronounce it. If they are made in England, they have a particular style in which they are made, and we call those delftware. And so you might wonder why all of these European countries were making basically the same kind of ceramic during this time period. Well, to sort of just very quickly talk about that for a moment, what they're trying to do is imitate Chinese porcelain, right? So Chinese porcelain is very much in demand by Europeans during this time period. And the Chinese are making what they call Chinese export porcelain. They're making a type of porcelain just to export to Europe, but it's very expensive. And only the most wealthy people can own very much of it. And so potters in Europe are trying to make something that imitates Chinese porcelain. And why do they have to imitate it? Because they don't know how to make it themselves. The recipe for how to make real porcelain, real Chinese porcelain, is a closely guarded state secret, and the Chinese don't want to share that with anybody. They don't want other people to know how to make true porcelain. So during this period, potters in Europe are making pottery that, at least on the outside, looks like porcelain, Chinese porcelain, but is not true porcelain in any sense of the word. So the French are doing it, the Dutch are doing it, the Spanish are doing it, and the British are doing it. And so let's look a little more closely at what makes something a tin-enameled earthenware. So if we look at this center photo for just a moment, you can see a piece of tin-enameled earthenware broken so that we can see it on edge. And when you look at a piece of tin-enameled earthenware on edge, a couple of things stand out. And the first one is the thickness of the glaze. So that tin oxide that is added to the lead glaze makes it thick. It's like the consistency of maple syrup. So potters would actually sometimes ladle the glaze on to the pots, or you could dip it into this thick, almost sauce-like glaze, and that's how they would glaze these pots. And so it is very thick, is the maybe the first thing that you notice. Sometimes archaeologists refer to it as having an eggshell-like quality. So the second thing that you'll notice when you look at these sherds on edge is that it's not fused very well to the paste or the body of the vessel. So it's not fired at a high enough temperature for the glaze and the paste to fuse the way that if you were to take a piece of ceramic out of your cupboard today and break it and look on the edge, you would have a more difficult time discerning where the glaze stops and the paste begins. That's because later ceramics are fired at a higher temperature, and the glaze and the paste tend to fuse better, which is one of the things that distinguishes true porcelain, is where the paste and the glaze fuse completely, right? It turns it completely to a glass-like substance. So here with tin-enameled earthenware, we don't get that at all, right? It's very loosely adhering to the paste, and it tends to flake off fairly easily, which you can see, or spall off very easily. So very often you'll find, on tin-enameled ceramics that it's crazed or cracked. The glaze cracks a lot, and it easily sort of spalls away, becomes dislodged from the paste. So that's how we distinguish it archaeologically. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for that these diagnostic characteristics. And then we look to the styles, the different styles of tin-enameled ceramics to hopefully be able to distinguish those British-made tin-enameled earthenwares from, say, French-made tin-enameled earthenware. So in these two photos, you can see some French faience. Whoops, let me go back very quickly here, and some British delftware here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this this issue. So when Doug was doing his work in the 1980s, a lot of the information that we have now about how to distinguish between the two styles of tin-enameled earthenwares wasn't really published. All right, there were some people that knew, and there had been some things that had been sites that had been excavated earlier that were guideposts for maybe being able to distinguish this, but there were no really good classification systems, especially for faience, until 1980, or I'm sorry, 2002. In 2002, Greg Wasselkov and John Wathall published a very important paper called Faience Styles in French Colonial North America, a revised classification. It came out in the journal Historical Archaeology, as I said, in 2002. So Wasselkov and Wathall had been looking at a lot of French pottery from sites from the Gulf Coast, the lower Mississippi River Valley, all the way up into the Illinois country, and maybe even a little further in some sites into the Great Lakes. And they began recognizing that there were very similar styles that you could sort of start to group into types. And they were mostly based on a couple of things, but one of the really important ways to distinguish these different styles and different types was by the decoration on the rims. And so they came up with this classification system based on wears and types and rim varieties. We're going to talk about two basic wares of faience. We're going to talk about faience blanche, which dates from about 1720 to 1800, at least in North America, and faience brune, which dates from about 1760 to 1800 in North America. Remembering, right, that 1800 is about the cutoff date for most specimens of faience in North America. After 1800, it's very, very rare. Now, the names that they use are made up by Wasselkov and Wathall, but they correspond to pottery making centers in France. So they call one type of faience blanche Normandy plain, because that style of ceramic was associated with potters in Normandy. However, and they say very clearly in their article, that doesn't mean that every example of Normandy plain that you find on an archaeological site in North America came from Normandy. Potters all over France were mixing and matching and making other people's styles. They're just using these names as a way to classify these types of faience and associating them with places in France where that type of pottery might have been commonly made. Okay. All right. So that's why the map is there, to just kind of show some of these French pottery making regions. Santage, where we're not really going to look at for this. Provence, we're also not going to look at the kinds of styles there. But Rouen, in this Normandy area, in the Brittany area, are where we're going to see some of these pottery styles that are important for being able to distinguish French faience from other types of ceramics. Okay, so let's look first at faience brune. So in general, as I noted, there are two recognized faience wares. The first being faience blanche, which is a white tin-enameled ceramic on both the interior and exterior surfaces. And I'll show you what I mean in just a moment, because right now we're going to look at faience brune, which dates to about 1760 to 1800 here in North America. And it has the white tin-enameled glaze on the interior of the vessel, but the exterior of the vessel has a manganese-infused brown lead glaze. So if you look at this plate from the 18th century site of Los Adayas in northwest Louisiana, you can see a great example of faience brune. It is typed as Rouen polychrome, right? So perhaps made in that region of France, but not necessarily. It's a polychrome because there are different shades of blue and black used in this decoration style, this rim style here that we see. And if you look at the back of this vessel, if you turn it over, you see that it has that brown manganese infused lead glaze on it. You can see a little bit of the tin glaze that has lapped over, right? Remember I said sometimes they're just slushing that stuff on with a ladle, so sometimes it'll spill over the edge onto the back, and you can see that it's done that here in a couple of places on this vessel. So this is faience blanche, about 1760 to 1800. The other thing that I'll note about these faience vessels is that the decoration tends to be in two locations: along the rim, just below the rim, and a center medallion. And that center medallion is almost always a floral motif, usually in an urn of some type, right? So those are very common motifs, these rim styles and a central medallion of some sort of floral design. Okay, so the second type, a ware type of faience that we are concerned with for our purposes tonight is faience blanche, which dates from about 1720 to 1800. So it has a little longer span of time that you can find it here in North America. And it is characterized by the tin glaze or tin enameling on both the interior and exterior of the vessel. And so this is a Brittany blue on white plate. And so you can see that it has both the tin glaze both on the interior of this shallow plate and on the exterior as well. You can also see that spalling that I talked about, right? How the glaze has sort of chipped off and away from the paste. It's called Brittany blue on white. Again, perhaps it was made in that Brittany region of France. But it's this style of decoration. It's a simple blue ring just below the rim on plates and bowls and other kinds of tablewares. These are all tablewares for the most part. And so it's known as Brittany blue on white. And here's the rim variety down here, right? So following their classification scheme, this would be a faience blanche, Brittany blue on white with rim variety A, right? And so this was a fantastic resource for archaeologists like Doug and like myself, who work in these time periods on these French fur trade era sites, because these are the kinds of ceramic vessels that the French would have been bringing with them on their excursions into the interior of North America and at some of the fur trade posts and some of the bigger forts like Michilimackinac and other places in the Great Lakes and Mississippi River Valley. Okay, so that's French faience, and we are able now to distinguish it pretty clearly because of the work of Wassilkov and Walthall. Okay, so let's jump down to Louisiana for just a few minutes, because some of you may know that before I came to St. Cloud State, I was at Louisiana State University. I was the Southeast Regional Archaeologist for the state of Louisiana for about 13 years. And while I was there, because my interest is in the French colonial period, I worked on quite a few sites where we found tin-enameled ceramics. And with this great classification system from Wasselkov and Walthall, I was able to become pretty familiar with faience. As you might imagine, French colonial Louisiana is one of the places where you might expect to find a lot of French faience, and in fact, I did. So this first site is a site called Point Capet. It dates from about 1730, much later into about 1865. But that 18th century component is definitely there. And the way that we see that component is through mostly through these ceramics, the faience. To just orient you a little bit, if you're familiar at all with Louisiana, this is the Mississippi River. Down here, just off of this map, on this side of the river would be Baton Rouge, and then of course farther down the river would be New Orleans. We are in Point Capet Parish, just north of the little town of New Roads, and just across the river from the town of St. Francisville in West Feliciana Parish, along a big meander bend in the river where the Mississippi River is running basically east and west, and this was known as Point Capet. So this is the site of a village of French, very small plantations. So all along this coast, as they called it the Point Capet coast, there were a number of very small French plantations, basically farmers, who had this kind of a linear village. There was actually a French fort up here at this end of the village, and a Catholic church just next to the fort. And then the settlements of the French farmers that went all along this Point Capet coast and up and around the bend up here past Morganza. So I did some work there while I was in Louisiana and recovered all of this 18th century French tin-enameled ceramics, the faience. And so in the first box up here, all of these are faience blanche, which means if you flip them over, of course, they would have the tin-enameled glaze on both sides, on the interior and the exterior. And you can see that they are classified and grouped by different rim varieties, right? So you see these different rim varieties and styles, including that Brittany blue on white right there, and some of those polychromes up here as well. And then you can see here, these are parts of that central medallion with that floral motif. And some of them are even polychrome, right? So you can see some reds and blues on some of those floral motifs in the center of those vessels. Down here we have the faience brune styles, and so here again is the center of the plate. These are those floral motifs and an urn, and then we have these different rim styles. But if you were to flip these over and look at the exterior surface, it would be covered with that brown manganese infused lead glaze on the back. So that's Point Capet, dates from 1730, as I said, to 1865. So very clearly occupied during the time period that we're interested in, the middle of the 18th century. Another site that I spent a lot of time working at when I was in Louisiana is a site called Galveztown. It dates a little bit later, from about 1776 until about 1830. And you might question this site a little bit. If you know anything about the history of Louisiana, you know that after 1763, it was no longer French. And that's true. So this site is actually a Spanish colonial site. It is actually also occupied by Canary Islanders, or Isleños as they were known. They were brought over from the Canary Islands by the Spanish. The Canary Islands were part of Spain at that time, and they were brought over to be settlers and soldiers, and they established these Canary Islanders in a series of presidios or forts and villages kind of ringing New Orleans. They were basically there to protect New Orleans from the British. So if you look at this map down here, you can see British West Florida on the east side of the Mississippi, and Spanish Louisiana on the west side of the Mississippi. And here's Galveztown right there on that border. This is a little bayou that flows out of the Mississippi into Lake Pontchartrain. And north of that were the British, and south of there were the Spanish. And so there was a fort there, Galveztown, a presidio, was occupied to check the British who might be moving in and off of the Mississippi River, trying to come in what was known as the back door to New Orleans via this little bayou or the Amite River into Lake Pontchartrain and into the backside of New Orleans. So Galvezstown was there to check that British movement. Now, you might also be wondering then, why is there so much French pottery at this site? Well, the French never really left Louisiana, right? The French government did, but the French people stayed on. And so many of the merchants in New Orleans continued to be Frenchmen or French people. And many of their connections were back to producers in France. And so French products still very much dominated the market in parts of Louisiana, including New Orleans. And so here at Galvezstown, these Canary Islanders, these Isleños, were using a lot of French pottery. Now, we did find a lot of Spanish Majolica at this site as well. So there were Spanish goods coming in to Louisiana during this time. But we found probably 2 to 1 in terms of the tin-enameled earthenwares there at the site, faience to Majolica. So much of the 18th century pottery found on this site was still French. And so we have very good examples of some faience blanche you can see with the St. Cloud polychrome with rim variety G. And here's some more. This is faience brune, a Rouen polychrome with rim variety G as well. There's that center medallion. And then we have over here some more faience brune, Rouen polychrome again with rim variety G. And down here for something a little bit different, faience blanche, same polychrome with rim variety C. Okay, so that's a pretty good sampling of French faience in a very French place, Louisiana, during the 18th century. And if you look at these styles again, I'll just go back very quickly. They don't really look very much like the decorative motifs that we see on the MO20 tin-enameled ceramics. So returning to Fort Duquesne and returning to Doug's idea that all archaeological interpretations are sort of tentative until you nail things down, by the 1990s, he had begun to question the interpretation that MO20 was Fort Duquesne. He wrote in 1999 that a focus of his present research was at MO20 was to determine who built the fort and when. So he was already questioning whether or not this was Fort Duquesne from 1752 to 1753. He further noted that to assign an anonymous fort site to either the 1750s or the 1760s, early 1770s period through archaeology alone requires bringing all lines of evidence into play. Where Doug turned his focus during this time was to the beads. I haven't mentioned the beads yet, but we have, and Doug recovered, over 10,000 glass beads at MO20. So there is an extensive collection of 18th century beads in the MO20 assemblage. And Doug thought that they might hold the key to helping him better understand the chronology of the site. Okay, so he started looking at the beads. I decided to look at the ceramics because I'm more familiar with them. And here's where we are with that. So when we look at the MO20 ceramics and we see these decorative styles, they don't look a lot like those French faience styles. So I started comparing these MO20 ceramics with ceramics from other sites occupied during this time period in the Great Lakes, and in particular up at Fort Michilimackinac. So I was able to go and look at some of the ceramic tin-enameled ceramics recovered from Fort Michilimackinac, and I was looking for patterns that matched. So here you can see these doors and windows of that structure that we saw earlier, and I'll come back to it in just a moment in the next slide. But here at Michilimackinac, you see very similar patterns, right? These rectangles or almost squares almost certainly represent doors and windows of a structure much like this one from MO20. Now, Ellen Schlasko has published a really important piece for archaeologists called Delftware Chronology, a new approach to dating English tin glazed ceramics that came out in 1989. And she refers to these as Asian-inspired landscape scenes, which include pagoda-style buildings on British Delftware dating from about 1671 to 1788. So again, at that latter time period would be right in the wheelhouse for MO20. Now, if we put that sherd back together with the piece that the teenagers found in the 1960s, now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces. You can see, so Doug has finished off what he thinks that structure would have looked like. And here's a piece of British Delftware from Fort Michilimackinac. Very similar style of structure. I have never seen a piece of faience with this decorative motif on it. Doesn't mean that it's not out there somewhere, just that I have never seen it, not in Louisiana or on other 18th century French sites that I've worked on, including sites in Indiana and other places as well. So this appears to me to be more along the lines of that Delftware as identified by Schlasko. But this is what kind of sealed it for me. Remember, Wassilkov and Walthall put a lot of emphasis on rim styles. And these are the rim decorations most prominent at MO20. It's this sort of geometric sgraffito style pattern. I have never seen anything quite like that on a French faience vessel. However, when we look at Michilimackinac, British Delftware, I see very similar kinds of styles, this sgraffito style pattern that Melanie Gervais classified as a geometric sgraffito style pattern on British Delftware, possibly from Bristol. And this came out in a publication from 2016. So these are all from Fort Michilimackinac on this side, and these are from MO20 on this side. And I think that that rim decoration style is very similar. So looking then at the research method for this project at Michilimackinac, I was able to go through the collections. They have them curated by artifact type, and so Lynn Evans, the curator at Michilimackinac, would bring out a box of blue decorated tin enameled or tin glazed earthenware, and I was just going through looking for motifs that matched the motifs from MO20. I wasn't looking at where the artifacts were found because that information wasn't on the bags with the artifacts, just the catalog numbers. So I would write down the catalog numbers. They didn't mean anything to me. I didn't know their provenience, where they came from. And then when I had a list of them, a page full of them, I would take them to Lynn, and she would pull up the catalogs and find those numbers. And lo and behold, whenever we had ceramics, that matched those patterns from ceramics from MO20, they were found in British context at the fort. So many of them were found at the British barracks, and others were found at the British officer's house. So that's pretty good indication to me that those ceramics are in fact British, and the other publications that I talked about seem to confirm that as well. But we have good archaeological, good contextual data that suggest that Michilimackinac, these ceramics are British, and that to me suggests that the ceramics at MO20 then are in fact British as well. So what does this mean? I think it means that Doug was right, that it was probably time to reevaluate MO20, and that he was correct to question its association with the French colonial era. The decorated tin enameled ceramics recovered from MO20 are almost certainly British delftware rather than French faience. This provides us with a terminus post quem, or date after which, for the site of 1763, because the British should not have been in this part of the Mississippi River Valley before 1763. It was French territory. Doesn't mean that there weren't some British around, but in theory, the site should date after 1763 if it is in fact British occupied. But that begs the question of who was there if not Joseph Marin. So Doug had already been thinking about that, right? He, as I said, had already started to come up with this new interpretation that he was not able to unfortunately complete his research with the beads. But he identified a couple of possible candidates. A British trader known only as Mr. Birdie was operating out of Crow Wing, a little bit north of where MO20 is located. Birdie was there between about 1767 and 1781. And another trader named James McGill was also near Crow Wing at about 1771 to 1772. So I've got some work to do. That work will be mostly archival, trying to trace down these and perhaps other British traders who might have been in the area. If I had to lean towards one of these two, I think Birdie or maybe some of his associates would be a good candidate because of the earlier date, the 1760s. One of the things that stands out at this site is that we don't get any later British ceramics like creamware or pearlware at this site, which would tip us off immediately that the site was after the 1760s, because that's when those styles of British ceramics come into the picture. So lacking those, I think the 1760s is probably a good date. And right now, the person most closely associated with the fur trade of that part of the Mississippi is only known by his last name, a Mr. Birdie. So I'll leave it there. Stay tuned. Hopefully some additional information will come from this research, and I'll get a chance to dig into the archives a little bit to help us understand a little bit more about who might have been at MO20 after 1763. Thanks. And if we have time for questions, I'm happy to take a few.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was a fantastic presentation. We did have a couple questions come in. If you're still kind of percolating over questions, make sure you add them to the chat so we can get them included in our Q&A session. You definitely anticipated one of the questions that came in. That was, you know, if it's not actually Fort Duquesne, then what other possibilities might exist? So you've addressed that as a sort of pending question, but with some possible answers there. So thank you for anticipating that one. One of the other questions we got was, why was it called Fort Duquesne? Like, does the name mean anything or have any significance?
So I don't know I'd have to look back at the exact name, but there were other French Fort Duquesnes. There's a French Fort Duquesne in Pennsylvania, for example. So it's named after some prominent family or some prominent person back in France. Oftentimes they're named after people who were like financially supportive of these ventures in North America. So if I had to guess, it would be something like that. But there were other Fort Duquesnes throughout New France.
Excellent, thank you. So besides the ceramics that we've clearly talked about and the beads that you've alluded to, are there other promising avenues of artifact research that might be pursued to sort of fill in the gaps about who might have been at this site?
I think so. I haven't had a chance to go through the collections completely yet, but I'm very interested in the gunflints, for example. I think that the gunflints could be very diagnostic. I've done some work on gunflints from a little bit later, early 19th century sites, looking at trying to distinguish French from British influences in who and how people are getting their gunflints. So I think that might be one avenue. There are some trade goods that might be diagnostic of some other time periods. Doug was very interested in the knives, for example. He's done a lot of work with typology on knife blades. I think there's a one or two axe heads, and those again can be kind of diagnostic, but usually the date ranges are pretty wide. And ceramic date ranges, especially for some of these faience styles, and maybe perhaps even some of these Delft styles, can be a little bit more narrow, especially with the terminal dates on them. So I think right now the ceramics are the most diagnostic that I've seen for indicating a British presence. But I haven't read everything that Doug wrote about the beads, and I have not looked at the beads, certainly not 10,000 beads myself. That's kind of a project waiting for someone, perhaps a graduate student, to take on. But yeah, I do think that there are other artifacts that might give us some clues as well.
Excellent. Next question I have is, how do you sort of reconcile the thought that the building might have exhibited French building styles with the fact that it might not be a French fort?
So that one's a little easier. When the British take over the fur trade in the 18th century, they put into place a very strict class structure, so that the bourgeois, that is the leaders of the fur trade companies and the head clerks of the fur trade companies, are always British men, but the laborers are almost always, in this part of the world anyway, French voyageurs, so French and French Canadian MAT individuals. And so who built those houses? Almost certainly they were French Canadians who built those, not houses, those structures at this post. And they built the structures that they knew how to build, and they built French style structures because they were French and French Canadian men.
Thank you. All right, well, that is all of the questions that I have at this time. So thank you again for joining us this evening. This was a fantastic presentation.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.